Hello, and welcome to the Kelly Lewis Podcast, where we ponder women's place in art, literature, and culture. You can call me Kelly, and today we're going to take a break from our series, History of Women's Stitching, to talk about women, the vote, and the pie, because I'm a mother and have daughters, and this year I've gotten political. If you're interested in my first two podcasts, we go way back to prehistoric time, talk about the division of labor agreed upon between men and women outside the hut, the origins of linen and wool, cotton and silk, and contemplate just how long women had been spinning and weaving. But for this podcast, let me explain the pie I am talking about. It's the proverbial pie of prosperity, illustrated by Stephen Covey in his popular book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The visual teaching of people trying to get the slice of pie they think they are entitled to, and how big that piece is before someone else gets that slice, might be relatively new. But the idea that there is not enough to go around is universal and timeless. It's called the scarcity mindset. How much there is or there is not of a pie in a particular society has been discussed in about every discipline from theology to sociology to economics. Rick Steves, the PBS tour guide of Europe, talks about the pie. Basically, he concludes when resources were abundant, when crops and trade was good, and when, people had opportunities in their future, no one worries much about the pie. When there is scarcity, crops are bad. When opportunities and jobs are limited, there are too many people, then we start worrying about the pie. I should mention here that if you're listening to this, you can also go to my website, kellylewispodcast.com, and read the blog that will have links to my resources like Rick Steves' video on YouTube, and also has a bunch of very cool and interesting and insightful political cartoons that I have found on wikimedia.com on both sides of the issue when women got the right to vote leading up to 1920. This one idea needs to stay in the back of your head while you consider women's voting history. Women got the right to vote by the 19th Amendment in 1920. My grandmother was alive in 1920. She was a little girl, but that meant that my great-grandmother, who I have met, did not have the right to vote until she was in her 30s, while black men got the right to vote by the 15th Amendment at the end of the Civil War in 1870. But that was 50 years before any women had federal protection for our right to vote. Think about that. You might be saying, I thought we were talking about a pie. We are. Do you know what is the root word for civilization? It comes from the Latin word civilis. So does citizen, civilian, and city. We started to think about the pie, to worry if there would be enough to go around about the time we moved into cities, built great civilizations. When we were more of an agricultural society, which I talk a lot about in History of Women's Stitching, there was a practical division of labor between men and women. I'm better at tending to children and cooking over fire than my husband. I would be wholly useless bringing down a woolly mammoth. I'd be too pregnant most of the time to be a warrior or to defend us or travel great distances to trade. But that all changed when we moved into cities, and some of us have been denied a slice of the pie or even the right to have an opinion about the care of that pie since. Except for, there is another condition that happens that affects the pie, and that is a quick, drastic change of not enough workers, not enough to take care of the things that allow that pie to be there. And that usually happens when, as I talked about in the History of Women's Stitching, terrible things happen. Like in the Middle Ages, after the Black Plague, the population decreased by 33%. And all of a sudden, the other two estates had to start paying attention to the peasant. World wars will do it too. That's how we got Rosie the Riveter in the wartime of the mid-1940s. Women had to come out of our homes and rivet and build bombers and then fly them over the ocean to deliver them in England and Europe to our husbands fighting over there. But when the end of the war was on the horizon, the end was in sight both in Europe and the Pacific, we started to think of all the jobs filled on the home front by women and all the soldiers that were coming home, and everyone was worried about that pie. How society got Rosie back in the kitchen so that her husband and his fellow soldiers had jobs is a whole series. But did you know that there was a pamphlet issued by the U.S. government about it? You can peruse and download that pamphlet on my website that the government issued as part of the U.S. Forces exit from the war, titled, "Do You Want Your Wife to Work After the War?" It discusses the pros and cons of the proper place for women. I think the pamphlet for the time is pretty balanced, but we will discuss the results of mid-century integration of men back into the workforce and women back into the kitchen another time. I know, I have a hard time saying integration, but such is the case worrying about that pie. Those in power find ways to exclude those groups with less power, and often it is society that first does the exclusion, even if by law other groups should have rights. After the Civil War, the slaves were freed. Many of the black men were highly skilled in such jobs as carpentry, shipbuilding, and other skilled labor jobs. And for a while, because of the loss of life in the war and the protection of the new rights they had in the 14th Amendment, blacks experienced some advancement in equality, only to be shaved away a few decades later in the Jim Crow era, fueled by the belief that there weren't enough slices of the pie to go around. Don't even get me started on how long it was before Native Americans were even considered citizens of this country, let alone had the right to vote. That will probably be its own podcast, blog, before the election. But even if black men fought for their right to vote, they were then subjected to clauses of needing to own land, have a grandfather that could vote, and the ability to read. Needless to say, they still had that right almost for a half a century before women. Well, women who did not reside in the West, where the protection of the pie still needed all hands on deck, all able-bodied souls to build new communities in the wild frontier, in a land that had been inhabited for thousands of years by other people. But like I said, we will get into that in another podcast blog. Women got the right to vote in Wyoming Territory in 1869, less than 5 years after black men got the right to vote in the 14th Amendment. That history is covered very well in an article from wyominghistory.org that you can access on my website. Let's just say in a nutshell, Wyoming needed more people to be considered for statehood and had somewhat of a negativity to the Native Americans, plus the blacks and the Chinese that were coming along with the railroad being built. Most agree that the decision of letting women to have the vote, something that has been tried in many states throughout the 1800s, could be described as a lesser evil choice. This idea of a lesser evil was just brought up by the Pope in which way he recommended his petitioners to vote in the 2024 presidential election, an idea that did not work so well for us women when it was brought up in the 2016 election, when I heard that term referred to the evangelical Christian endorsement of a said candidate that went on to be president and now was tried and convicted in a hush money scheme with an adult film star. His poor, disrespectful treatment of women, multiple women, was bad, but he was a lesser evil than the more evil agenda of what the other party was offering, which was actually a devout Catholic and the first female running for vice president, who was previously the Attorney General of California. Don't tell me women's rights are not at the bottom of the bucket. Enough said, but the idea of a lesser evil is often used in politics and was used back in the 1800s in Wyoming because the assumption that white women would vote like their husbands is a credible one, and as long as white women vote like their husbands, that protects the pie. It is important to remember that in the mid-1800s, Republicans were the Democrats and the Democrats were the Republicans. In other words, the Democrats were the ones trying to keep the status quo and fought all the newfangled ideas of equality of blacks and women, let alone being concerned about the Asian population or the Native Americans. Lincoln's Republicans were pushing to have more equality spread to everyone in the country by laws and elected officials. Where do you stop such crazy notions? That would be by limiting who not only has the right to vote, but also can cast that vote. And those two things are very different.
Of course, people across the country were up in arms when the women in the Utah Territory got the right to vote in 1870. So close in their timelines, both Wyoming and Utah try to claim being the first. Whether that is giving the right, Wyoming, or actually casting the first ballot, Utah. But eyebrows were raised across the country because of the salacious practice of polygamy in Utah. Opinions differed on if that would give more votes to their husbands or empower the women to abolish the patriarchal practice, which did not happen. And leading up to statehood and pretty much a condition for it, the vote was taken away from women in Utah, and laws were created forbidding polygamy, though the practice continued after 1887. When Utah gained statehood in 1896, the vote was given back to the women, and they could hold office, and so continued the snickering of the rest of the country in newspaper articles, debating how many votes did Utah men actually get. Do go to kellylewispodcast.com to see all the great political cartoons I have found debating for and against women's suffrage. In some parts of Colorado, women had already been voting in local elections such as school boards and had been holding local leadership positions as early as 1877, all because there was not enough workers in those mining and frontier towns to maintain the pie of prosperity. But in 1893, Colorado gave all women in the state the right to vote, the first through a statewide referendum. After Colorado came more western states, Idaho in 1896, Washington in 1910, California in 1911, Oregon and Arizona in 1912, Montana in 1914, North Dakota, New York, and then Rhode Island in 1917, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Michigan in 1918. Of course, the Spanish flu epidemic, 1918 to 1920, and our involvement in World War I, April 1917 to November 1918, put a kink in the progress in the momentum of other states following, but reversely, women's efforts during the war and the great male loss of life, plus all the loss from the epidemic, evened out that prosperity pie for a while. And in 1920, women received the right to vote across the country by the 19th Amendment. Sound familiar? Great social unrest like the plague, wars temporarily give opportunity to the minorities in a society. It is important to remember that women have never 100% agreed as women on if we should have the right to vote or how to go about it to get it. The great Susan B. Anthony was so disgusted with the lack of zeal for the vote from the more conservative women in the southern counties in Colorado, where I might add I live, that she swore to never come back and campaign in the state after an earlier attempt to get the women's vote was cast down. Did I mention that's where I live? How demure we should be might be a running joke on TikTok right now, but there has always been a judgment on how demure women should be. And once the war, the plagues, Western expansion, and the frontier danger has passed, the expectation in this country, at least, is for us to pull inward and, well, stop using our brains and our abilities to move aside for the men. It makes my skin crawl as a woman and as a mother of daughters, how in the last few weeks I have heard that idea come out from one of the candidates for president. And then his buddy, a billionaire, offered to put a baby in Taylor Swift after she endorsed the other candidate for president. And what is it with football players telling us to step aside, take a rest because they got this. But they don't got this. That is why women were voting and holding offices in my state of Colorado before any women in America should have been. The menfolk were all down at the creeks panning for gold. We had to build the towns, hold the offices, be concerned with the running of the mining town schools, because the men rushing to Colorado certainly were not going to be doing it. But what did women vote for when we could? Or what were we inspired to fight for or against when we could not vote? This is the big one. Prohibition. And we did that before half the women in the country could even vote. It was the 18th Amendment passed by Congress on December 18, 1917, 1.5 years before the 19th Amendment gave at least all white women the right to vote and have a voice at the polls. And how we pulled that off is a podcast in itself, which I will do. But needless to say, women were persistent. And well, they had had enough. From the PBS Ken Burns documentary, which you can view, get a click for on my website, by 1830, the average American over the age of 15 consumed nearly 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year, 3 times as much as we drink today. And alcohol abuse, primarily by men, was wreaking havoc on the lives of many, particularly in an age when women had few legal rights and were utterly dependent on their husbands for substance and support. Another hot issue for women in the 1920s, their own mortality rates in childbirth, and their children's high mortality rates were of great concern for women, and for good reason. According to Wikipedia, in around 1915, at that time, almost 100 infants per 1,000 died born to white mothers, and almost 200 infants born to black mothers died per 1,000. Today, the infant mortality rate is 6 out of 1,000 births. I know, such a radical leftist idea bringing health care to expectant mothers. The 1920 campaign made big promises if the right party was elected, but improving women's health never really came to fruition. Sound familiar? Another hot issue for women was the marriage age of their daughters. Again, in an era that they had no say in when their husbands could give their daughters to a man of his choosing. When we became a great country around 1776, that age for girls was 12 years old, with the consent of the parents, or actually the consent of the fathers. Girls were given over in marriage, and their mothers had no say, no power, no avenue to stop it. What woman in her right mind would want to go back to that time? Find the Wikipedia article on Kelly Lewis Podcast's website. But here are the high notes, or I should say the low notes. For example, I quote, "In California, early statutes forbade sexual intercourse with females under the age of 10, following the English statute of 1576. In 1889, the California statute was amended to raise the age to 14, and the age was raised to 16 in 1897. In the late 19th century, still quoting for Wikipedia, a social purity movement composed of Christian feminist reform groups began advocating a raise in the age of consent to 16, with the goal of raising it ultimately to 18. By 1920, when women got the vote, 26 states had an age of consent of 16, 21 states had an age of consent of 18, and one state, Georgia, had an age of consent of 14 years old. Yep, saving our homes from drunken male providers, saving ourselves and our children from death in childbirth, and our daughters from being, what demure word should I use, being given over at such young ages to serve husbands we had little authority in choosing. Those are the uneducated, emotional issues women were concerned with just 100 years ago when we got the right to vote. Of course, there's a whole lot more, literally plastered on campaign t-shirts sold in the TikTok shops right now. When we could have a bank account in our own name, when our husbands did not make our medical decisions for us, when we could get a mortgage on our own, buy a business, have the right to a divorce, not be thrown into the loony bin if we were difficult. The list goes on. And most of what I just listed off happened after 1970, after I, as a middle-aged woman, was born, and just a few years after my own mom divorced my dad. I didn't know how new of right she had to raise us on her own and start her own business. I did not know my mom was one of the first to even be able to own her own house or fight for her right to a divorce. Now we get to the sticky part. I am a devout Christian, a follower of Christ, and have tried to be obedient to what I think God wishes according to my understanding of the Bible. And I don't think God is happy about divorces, but women not having the ability to pursue them legally is a whole different thing, which leads to the most sticky campaign issue in this election: abortion. Something else that I firmly believe makes God sad, and frankly me sad, to think of those little sweet beings who won't have a chance at life. But before anyone comes at me from either side, because when you are a politically moderate, oddly, everyone can hate you. I am voting for Kamala Harris this election, for many reasons, but let's clear up the abortion confusion I might have caused. According to a survey reported in the National Library of Medicine, you can access on my website, while 33% of women were confident in their decision to end their pregnancy, more were not. And I quote, 60% reported they would have preferred to give birth if they had received more support from others or had more financial security. Kamala might be way too liberal in her general ideologies for me, but she sees that improving cost of living, the housing crisis, education, jobs for the middle class will improve the lives of most of us, and it will vastly improve the lives of women and children. Think about it. Husbands and families that are a support for women raising these babies, lessening the financial burden for mothers. Those ideas fit right in line with the desires and the wishes of the crazy women who fought for their homes and families 100 years ago. I love that we are chipping away at abortion rates. There were 1.6 million in a year in the 1990s, and they've fallen to just under 1 million per year in 2020. Probably due to the availability of birth control, the ultrasound making early connection between parents and child, and the greater involvement of fathers. I'll take it. If Kamala Harris is able to accomplish what she wants and relieve some of the burden on young families, I assume those rates will go down even more. But denying medical care with miscarriages or non-viable fetuses or health of the mother by state law and then hunting those women down is just hateful. I better stop before I type something I will regret. Which all proves who is not going to have these concerns in the forefront of their minds for this election, even if they don't hate women. Men. I love them. I'll keep them. Mine keeps me warm at night, is a great provider, a great father, and my best friend. Do I want to step aside and have faith he can look out for my legal rights? No. Do I think that is what God wants, for a man to look out for my legal rights? No. My faith governs my choices, but there is nowhere in the Bible that God, Jesus, or any writer argues that change, real change, should come from the government in religious matters. Give Caesar what is Caesar's, is what Jesus said. In other words, pay your taxes and turn towards God for real change. Of course, be active in government. Fight the good fight if you are led. Be a good citizen, but put your hope in what will not rust or tarnish or fall away. Now, the next sticky issue with women in politics, being humble. Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders thinks Kamala Harris is not humble because though being a stepmother to two, she did not biologically have children of her own. I don't agree with Governor Sanders. I think motherhood made me, what is the opposite of humble? Proud, noble, and well overbearing. I like the word brave. That is why I'm writing this, putting it up as a podcast, because I am the mother of daughters that might have less rights than me as their mother and possibly their grandmother in 2024. I think Governor Sanders, like a lot of good Christian women, church-going ladies, considered Proverbs 31 to be the handbook of the humble mother, with phrases like, her children will raise up and call her blessed. The assumption is they called her blessed for her humble and quiet manner. As church-going ladies, we don't seem to read the rest of the chapters, or we forget it all too easily. The Proverbs 31 woman was anything but humble, managing the entire household, having a side hustle of making cloth that made money. Go to my first two podcasts on the history of women's stitching to understand what that included. She was being the manager of her family as well, allowing her husband to sit at the gates. That is Old Testament talk, for he was an official of their town or city, and he could do that because she took care of everything else. Her children rose up and called her blessed, not because she was demure or humble, but because she was a badass, and while they probably had clean underwear and socks or the equivalent in Bible times. Ladies, no matter how conservative or liberal you are, we have our history blocked from us and out changed too much. Call it social norms or pressures, gaslighting, wanting to fit in, being churched, or what you like. But women are oppressed in this country. The goal is to limit who has a say in exactly how that pie, remember the pie, is going to be doled out. We are also a nation of, well, as Colin Woodward thinks in his book, American Nations, a history of the 11 rival regional cultures of North America. A whole lot of ethnic groups that after 200 years of history have more to do with how we live and vote than our party affiliations. Read it and you will never look at the Electoral College the same way again. But what I do find odd and unfair is that the woman's right to vote and our issues have always been attached to liberal movements. Let me say that another way. Our rights as women have almost always been attached to ideologies and laws that are considered far left. And as a nation, when we rein in those crazy left liberal ideas, part and parcel, we seem to take rights away from half the population. Actually, according to Google right now, that would be 50.4% of the population is women. In other words, the rights of women are gained and lost depending on how liberal or conservative the party in power is. And this is not a new thing or unique to the United States. Many countries like Sweden and Hawaii, when it was a sovereign nation, had given limited voting rights to women and then stripped them of those rights. Wikipedia articles are on my website. But a coup d'etat overthrow of Hawaii and the last queen, which I will never be able to pronounce her name, ruling in 1893, installed a provincial government, and then women were barred from voting by that provincial government. Sweden, female tax-paying members of the city guilds were allowed to vote in local elections. Then that right was rescinded in 1758 and then again in 1772. Okay. I've given you all I have as a fellow woman, maybe talking more to my friends who are conservatives, hate abortion, and are faithful followers of Jesus to consider this election. Like I said, this election, I'm going to vote for a candidate that is much more liberal than I like. I would like nothing better, next election, if the country leans even more liberal, to bring it back to the middle by voting for a moderate Republican. Heck, or a Democrat. Republican. Doesn't matter to me, actually. Middle is what I am looking for. Leaders that can come to the table and compromise, care about our young people, our kids and our babies in and out of the womb, and the moms and the dads that are taking care of them. In those concerns, I think I would be joining in with my fellow suffragettes 100 years ago, feeling like enough is enough, with a crisis to my family, to my children, not that much different than this election. Today, you do not have to vote the way your husband votes. You do not have to try and sway him or explain your decision. Vote for you. Vote for your daughters and for your granddaughters, as well as for your sons. You can vote that way you choose because you are an intelligent, brave soul, and that is actually what motherhood teaches us, to be brave.
Next day postscript, and apparently a different sounding voice. But what is it about including cats when trying to insult women? Apparently, the opposition was doing that in the 1920s, arguing that women could not handle leadership roles because we might like cats. In a National Park Service article linked on my website, check out the political cartoons making the connection between women, cats, and the threat of domesticating, masculating husbands. So apparently, cats have always been connected to women for both tendency to be homebodies and likely liking coziness, when men were more active and out and about the town, so connected to dogs. I think a house cat has the same brain as a mountain lion, just a smaller body. So I hold to my proclamation that we as women, wives, and mothers are brave when we need to be. We might like homey and soft things, and just like cats, we might keep our claws in most of the time, but don't think we don't have them. Not sure what will be coming next to the Kelly Lewis podcast, but will probably be coming sooner than later. Until then, have a blessed day and enjoy the ones you love.